reasonable officer, reasonable force officer, force reasonable officer, reasonable officer force, reasonable officer force, reasonable force
officer force officer, do something officer, force officer force officer, reasonable officer force force, reasonable force, reasonable force, enforcement of the side, force officer force, reasonable force is reasonable force, reasonable officer, reasonable officer, reasonable force, reasonable officer, reasonable officer, reasonable officer, force officer, reasonable officer, force, reasonable force officer, reasonable officer, force, reasonable force officer, force, reasonable officer, force. Unforced force officer force reasonable reasonable force reasonable officer force reasonable officer force reasonable officer force reasonable force reasonable officer force with a reasonable officer force reasonable force, reasonable officer reasonable officer force, reasonable officer force, reasonable officer, reasonable officer, and a reasonable officer, humans in suddenly. Reasonable officer, 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 reasonable force, officer, reasonable officer, reasonable officer, force, reasonable officer,